So let's talk about selecting wood for your skin-on-frame kayak. Now, when we think about boat building wood, usually you can get 2 of 3 desirable properties, which is light, strong, and rot resistant. So for example, red cedar is very light and very rot resistant, but not very strong. Sitka spruce is very light, is relatively strong, but not very rot resistant. And something like a white oak might be extremely strong and extremely rot resistant, but definitely not very light. So it's just a matter of choosing the wood that has the appropriate structural characteristics for the different parts of the kayak framework. And I feel like the best way to illustrate this is just to take a couple of my half-scale models off the wall here. I've got my West Greenland kayak and my F1 kayak design here, and I'm going to walk you through the framework here and show you the woods that I chose for the different parts, why I chose those woods, give you some ideas for substitutions, and then also just give you some insights into selecting and milling the wood for different parts of the kayak frame here. Now, just a quick word on shopping for your kayak wood. The plans that we sell on our website in conjunction with our online video courses have really detailed cut lists in them, and it's always a good idea to print out that cut list and bring it to the lumber store with you, because oftentimes they're not going to have the wood that you are hoping to make these different pieces out of, but they may have good, long, clear wood in different dimensions. And if you've got your cut list with you, you can stand there in front of the boards and you can kind of visualize how you might be able to get the different pieces for your kayak frame out of the wood that you've got available. So first up here, let's just go to the very smallest pieces of wood that I use in my skin-on-frame kayak, which is just a handful of dowels. So these are 4-foot long birch dowels. The reason I like birch is because it's usually a little stronger than standard hardware store dowels, and it's a little more accurately sized, but it's not too expensive. If you can't find birch, really any other kind of dowel is going to work just fine. Now, I've got a couple of 1/4-inch dowels that I'm going to use for pegging the ends of the kayak together and also for pegging the deck beams diagonally into the gunnels. I've got a couple of 1/8-inch dowels that I'm going to use for pegging the tenons on the deck beams and also for pegging on the secondary stringer. And then finally, I've got a single 3/16 dowel that's going to be used for different purposes depending on which kayak you're building. And if you can't find yourself a 3/16, that's fine. You can just end up using your 1/4-inch and it'll still work out. So you're going to need some type of a softwood for your keel, your stems, your stringers, your gunnels, your secondary stringers, your deck beams, and in the case of my modern kayaks here, this deck stringer right here on the front of the kayak. Now, my wood of choice for this is red cedar because it's very beautiful and it's very rot resistant, but honestly, neither of those things really matters because you're going to have a skin covering your frame so you can't see the wood, and rot is rarely an issue in a skin-on-frame kayak. The reason that I actually like red cedar is just because it's a very lightweight wood. You can build these kayaks out of fir or spruce or pine, but any of those other woods are going to add between 3 to 5 pounds to your finished kayak, and red cedar is the only one that's going to reliably allow you to build one of these kayaks around 30 pounds or less. Now, the only time I wouldn't choose red cedar is if I, for some reason, needed a little bit of extra durability. Like, say for instance, in the new river kayaks that I'm working on right now, the keels on those are only a 1/2 inch tall, which means that red cedar isn't going to be strong enough. And so for the keels and the stringers, I might switch to a stronger wood like yellow cedar or Port Orford cedar or Douglas fir or Sitka spruce, although I might stick with red cedar for other parts of the framework. So it's important that you actually check the plans for the boat that you're building, because I'm going to have a lot more detailed notes about what I think works better in different situations. Now, for the stems, for the deck beams, and for all the other small pieces of wood here, you don't need super high quality wood. You could even use construction grade lumber and work your way around the imperfections. But for the longer wood, like the keel and the stringers and the gunnels, you really want these to be as straight grained and as clear as possible. Now, for your keel and your stringers, those need to be absolutely clear and absolutely straight grained. Your gunnels can tolerate a little bit of grain imperfection and a few very small knots, as long as neither of those things happens right on top of a deck beam location. Because if you have the mortise for the deck beam and an imperfection in that area, it could potentially weaken the wood in this area and you could theoretically have a failure. Now, grain orientation doesn't really matter here. These boards can be flat grain, they can be vertical grain, they can be diagonal grain, but the one thing they can't be is different grain orientations on different sides of the kayak, because that could potentially cause one gunnel to flex differently than the other gunnel, which might be frustrating during your building process and could potentially affect the symmetry of your finished kayaks. So when you're cutting out your boards, you just want to make sure you're cutting them in a way that you're getting roughly similar grain on either sides, and you check the flex of the wood to make sure it's, just sort of in the same neighborhood before you start assembling the kayak. So next up here, you're going to need some type of a rot-resistant hardwood to make a few miscellaneous pieces on the decks of the different kayaks. Now, my choice of wood for this is Eastern ash because it's rot-resistant and it's strong, but it's not too heavy for a hardwood. Now, if you can't find Eastern ash, you can really use any kind of rot-resistant hardwood as long as it's not too prone to splitting. And the pieces that we're going to be making out of these are the aft deck stringers that your butt lands on when you're getting in and out of the kayak, and that's for my modern kayaks and the West Greenland kayak, but not the East Greenland kayak. Now, for the modern kayaks, that's pretty much it. But for the Greenland kayaks, you're also going to make the masik here, which is the piece of wood that goes over your thighs while you're sitting in the kayak, and the foredeck stringers that come forward from that, although those are pretty different in the East and the West Greenland kayak. And then finally, you're going to make the breast hooks, which are the little plates that join the stems to the gunnels at either end of the Greenland kayak. Now, just a quick word on grain orientation here. For your masik here, you really want the grain orientation to be vertical. So when you cut it to a curve, you don't end up with what's called short grain, where the grain cuts across the narrow part of the wood, making it potentially prone to breaking. Now, for your breast hooks out here, you really want those to be flat grain, because even though it's going to be a little bit annoying because it's going to want to tend to cup while you're working, it's going to be way less prone to potentially splitting out in the future while the end of your kayak kind of weathers and gets water in it and is constantly flexing and expanding and contracting. So flat grain for the breast hooks at the end here, and vertical grain for your masik, and then for everything else, doesn't really matter. Now, just a quick side note here, unless I'm making a kayak that's either very narrow or for a very lightweight person, I'm usually building this deck beam that sits at the back of the cockpit out of a little bit stronger wood than red cedar. So say a fir or a spruce, anything that's just a bit stronger would be fine, unless the person is really heavy, in which case I might consider building this deck beam out of ash. So now let's dive into what's probably the most complicated topic here, which is selecting wood for steam bending your ribs and for steam bending your combing. So starting out with species, you're looking for a wood species that's going to bend well, but it's also strong and rot resistant. So some examples from here in the United States might be black locust, white oak, or eastern ash. Now, my number one choice for bending wood is white oak because it's very strong, it's very rot resistant, and it bends to a very tight radius. Now, black locust is also very strong, it's even more rot resistant, but it's not going to bend to quite the same radius as white oak, and it's also pretty hard to get your hands on. Now, eastern ash isn't as strong or as rot resistant as either of those other woods, but it still bends pretty well, and it has the added benefit that it also can bend sometimes when it's kiln dried. Now, there are other woods that will bend well, that are rot resistant and are strong in different parts of the world. So if you can't get your hands on any of the woods that I'm mentioning here, just check with local boat builders, furniture makers, anybody that's really into wood, and find out what works and what is available locally. Now, moisture content is also a really important issue. Your best bending wood is going to be cut fresh off the log with a really high moisture content, and air-dried wood is kind of be your second choice. Now, your last choice is going to be kiln-dried wood because kiln drying damages the lignin, which really kind of damages the steam bending properties. Now, if all you can find is kiln-dried wood and you have no other choice, what you want to do is cut it up into strips and soak it in water with a little bit of fabric softener, because the surfactants in that are going to drive the moisture deep into the wood, and once it takes up the water after a week or two, it's going to steam bend a lot better than it would otherwise, but it's still not going to steam bend anywhere near as good green bending wood that's cut fresh off the log. One of the most common comments that I get from my kayak building students is that they should have just spent the money and got good green bending wood. So I'm going to pass that suggestion on to you. Even if it's expensive or hard to find, you're going to have so much of an easier first kayak build if you're working with good bending stock. Now, something that might influence your decision on what wood you're going to get and how much of it you're going to get is whether you're going to be building your own combing. Now, if you're building a Greenland kayak, the combing stock doesn't need to be that good because the radius of the bend isn't really that tight, and it only needs to be about a little over 6 feet long. But if you're building one of my modern kayaks with the keyhole shaped cockpit combing, you're going to need a full 8 feet of really primo bending stock to be able to bend that relatively thick wood to the tight radius at the top of that. And that might kind of change your choices of what woods you want to go with. You can always order one of these off of my site, and then you can order your rib wood in shorter lengths, and it's always easier to find shorter lengths of steam bending wood than it is to find longer lengths, because imperfections are just a natural part of a wood bending stock. Now, your ideal piece of bending wood here is going to be free of knots and imperfections, and it's going to have straight grain that follows the edge of the board. Now, unfortunately, we don't live in an ideal world. Even good quality bending oak like this right here is usually going to have a little bit of sapwood on the outside like this, and it's going to have some unusable heartwood on the inside. So even if you're ordering bending wood, you want to take a couple inches off the width of the plank before you start calculating for the amount of wood that you're going to need. Now, something that's often the case is the grain will be a little bit crossways across the board, in which case what you want to do is scribe a line along the grain and then recut that with a circular saw, so when you run it through your table saw, you're going to have strips of wood that follow the grain, which means they're going to be the least likely to break. Now, if you're buying this stuff rough sawn, it's really good if you can buy it rough sawn just a little bit thicker than your planed dimension, because if you're buying it a lot thicker, you're going to be running this through your stationary planer quite a few times and putting a lot of wear on those knives before you can get down to your finished dimension. Now, if you can't get good vertical grain or rift grain boards like this one right here, but you can get really good flat sawn boards that have straight grain along the edge back here, what you can do is cut strips of wood that are as wide as your ribs are tall, and then you can flip those 90 degrees and run them through your table saw and get your ribs that way. Your yield for that's not going to be quite as good, but it's going to get you back to the grain orientation you're looking for, which is a flat sawn or rift grain rib. So vertical grain boards run through your table saw are going to give you flat sawn or rift grain ribs, which is what you're looking for here. Now, something you especially want to watch out for if you're picking out your bending oak in person is to look for pin knots on the face, because even beautiful boards like this can have quite a few pin knots, and you get too many of those in there and it can really cut your yield down. Now, a good rule of thumb for determining yield is to expect to get 2 ribs out of every horizontal inch of your bending wood and 1 combing out of every horizontal inch. Now, when you're ordering this stuff, it's not realistic to expect wood suppliers or sawmills to rip off the sapwood or the heartwood before they ship this to you, but it is totally okay to ask them to cross-cut this to the lengths that you want, which might be preferable to them because it's much easier for sawyers to find good clear sections of shorter wood than it is for them to find longer wood. Now, one way to get a little bit better yield out of your precious bending wood is to cut it with a thin kerf circular saw blade, but there are some things you need to think about if you're going to do this. Now, the first one is you still want to edge your board with your regular table saw blade and also cut your combing strips out, because this is going to be stiffer and it's going to cut a lot straighter. Now, when you go to put your circular saw blade on your table saw, keep in mind that the label is reversed. And so if you're looking at this label while you're putting this on the table saw, the blade's going to be going the wrong direction and it's not going to cut very well. Now, you also may need to add an additional washer on your arbor to be able to hold this securely in place. And then finally, you want to feed a little bit slower because the outside diameter of this is less, so the effective blade speed is slowed down, and you'll get a much smoother cut if you just slow down a little bit. Now, while you're cutting with this, it's pretty common for this wet wood to really gum up these blades out here, and then it's going to start to wander in the cut. So as soon as you start to see it get really kind of gummy with wood around the edge, stop your saw and take a moment with some WD-40 and a Brillo pad and just clean the outside edge, and then it'll cut nice and straight. Now, as always, table saw safety is your responsibility. You want to be cutting with push sticks, you want to be using a zero clearance insert, you want to be wearing eye protection, and you always want to stay out of the line of fire of the blade when you're cutting up these ribs. I've seen these ribs catch in a table saw and shoot 30 feet and then go through a wall. Now, if it can do that, that means it can go right through your stomach as well. So always be off to the side while you're cutting your ribs and using safe techniques on your table saw. So just a quick word on sourcing bending wood. If you live in a part of the world where a bending species grows, sometimes you can find a sawmill that'll cut this up for you. Now, generally you're not going to have any luck by asking around at lumber stores or even specialty wood stores. Usually you've got to get on the phone, call some sawmills. If you tell them you're building a boat, oftentimes that gets people interested, and somebody will know somebody who knows somebody who's cutting up good bending wood. Now, if you can't get this stuff locally, you can always order this online as well, but for a full-size board, you're going to expect to pay as much in shipping as you're paying for the wood itself, which can get pretty pricey because good bending wood can run you upwards of $10 a board foot. Now, before you get sticker shock on that, it is important to consider the alternative, because I think when people start seeing prices that are that high, they start thinking, couldn't I just do this out of kiln-dried wood? And yes, you can, but oftentimes you're going to be going back and forth to the lumber store, you're going to be cutting up wood in strips, you're going to be waiting weeks for it to soak, and then you're going to try to steam it. It turns out it's not going to steam very well. Then you're going to head back to the lumber store, you're going to try a different wood, you're going to cut that up into strips for a few weeks, you're going to try to steam that, and maybe that steams and maybe it doesn't. And you can see how really quickly here, the price of good bending oak starts to seem like a pretty good deal. Now, if you don't feel like buying whole boards, or let's say you don't have the machinery to cut them up, I do sell pre-cut kayak ribs on my website. It ends up being a little bit more money for the wood itself, but it ends up being a lot less money for the shipping. And especially if you're ordering a kayak kit from me, it's really easy for me to send these in the same box, and then the additional shipping cost is pretty reasonable. So to finish up the section on steam bent woods here, I just want to circle back to a couple things I forgot to mention. The first one is that I've had decent luck bending kiln-dried hickory that's been soaked for a couple weeks. Hickory isn't generally considered a boat building wood because it's not super rot resistant, but it's very dense and very strong, so I feel like it could be okay in a skin-on-frame kayak if it's what you have available. Now, another thing I want to mention is a product that has become popular for some people in the skin boat building community, and that is 6mm carbonized edge laminated bamboo. And what this stuff is, it comes in a little thin sheet, looks kind of like a little countertop. It's been treated with heat, and for whatever reason, this stuff seems to bend okay. I experimented with this for a couple years, but ultimately I decided not to use it because it's not consistent from batch to batch. You'll get batches that bend okay, and then you'll get batches that bend terrible. It's also really hard to bend to the really extreme radiuses that I make in some of the different parts of the kayak. And finally, it seems to deteriorate a little more quickly than I'm comfortable with on the inside of a skin-on-frame kayak. So if all you can get is this edge laminated bamboo, it is very light and it is very strong. It just wouldn't be my first choice for building a skin-on-frame kayak. So final thing I want to mention here is that you never want to use red oak for making your kayak ribs. Red oak has an open pore structure which allows vapor to permeate it, which makes a perfect environment for fungus. And that makes it literally the only wood that I've ever seen rot out in less than a year in a skin-on-frame kayak. Rot is rarely ever an issue in a skin-on-frame kayak, but red oak will definitely make that happen. So that concludes the section here on steam bending. I know that was really long and it was a lot of information, but I really like to drill down into the details here because steam bending is oftentimes the most intimidating part of building a boat, and it's something that can be really easy and really enjoyable even if you're a first-time boat builder, or it can be incredibly frustrating depending on the wood that you're using and the techniques that you're using to bend that wood. So I think how I want to close out the video here is I'm just going to get a stack of boards and walk you through kind of the standard recipe for the boards that I like to grab at the lumber store if I'm going to build a skin-on-frame kayak. But keep in mind that these are just the boards I would choose if there was good wood in those dimensions. And if there was better wood in different dimensions, I would choose that. So let's pretend for a minute that there is some magic lumber store where you can get all of your boat building wood in one place. So first up here, we're going to get a couple of 1/4-inch birch dowels. We're going to get one 3/16-inch birch dowel. We're going to get two 1/8-inch birch dowels. Next up, we're going to pick out some ash. And unfortunately, I can't give you any advice for this because the amount that you need is totally different for the different boat designs. Now, heading down into our bending oak here, you want to make sure that you're getting this a little bit thicker rough sawn than the finished ribs that you're going to need, because you're going to have to plane this down a little bit. Now, if you're just building ribs, a couple sections of this that are 8 inches wide by 30 inches long is going to give you a perfect amount of ribs, and it's going to give you a few extra. But if you're building a combing, you're going to want to get this board 8 feet long for a keyhole cockpit and 6.5 feet long for a Greenland style cockpit. Now, heading down to the softwoods here, I'm going to pick up a 1x8 by 10, and I'm going to be able to get my stems out of that. I might get some secondary stringers. I might get my deck ridge for my modern kayak, and there will be some leftover chunks that you can get some deck beams or other miscellaneous parts out of. Now, getting down to our final board here, this is a 1x10 or 1x12 by however long your kayak needs to be, and you're going to get your gunnels, you're going to get your stringers, and you're going to get your keel out of this piece, and maybe a little secondary stringer if you got a little bit left over. Now, a final piece of wood that I like to buy, if I can get my hands on it, is a clear, straight-grained red cedar 4x4, because this is a really easy way to get 1 or 2 blanks for making a Greenland paddle. Now, of course, you can make a Greenland paddle out of any kind of wood, but I almost always use red cedar, because if you're talking about paddling all day with something, a few extra ounces really makes a difference in your paddling experience, and I don't mind paddling with something that's a little bit more fragile, just to have a paddling experience that's a little bit more enjoyable. Now, the way that I like to cut these on a table saw is to run my blade up to 1 7/8 inches, set the fence at 1.5 inches, and then I can run the board through, flip it 180 degrees, and then run it through again. And if you cut this so you're seeing the flat grain while you're cutting on your table saw, the piece that falls off will be a vertical grain paddle blank. Now, it's super important that you pick out a 4x4 that is as straight as possible, because if there's a little bit of curve in it as a 4x4, you can bet it's going to be curved a lot once you split it in half. Now, additionally, once you get your paddle blank out of this, there's a couple things you can do. If it's a really great piece, it almost makes sense just to cut yourself another paddle blank, because they're so hard to find. But if there's imperfections in the side that fell off, what I like to do is cut a section of this to 27 inches, and then I can use that to make the laminations for my curved deck beams. So you can just set your table saw to a little over 1/8. You can take that section, and then you can just take those slices for your curved deck beam laminations. Just a really quick, easy way to do it. Now, final thing I want to talk about is scarf joints, because if you live in a part of the world where there's no way you can get any long, clear wood, you're going to have to resort to cutting some opposite angles and gluing them together, also known as scarf joints. Now, there's a lot of ways to do this, and a lot of them are really frustrating and not very accurate. The way that I like to do this is to make a jig and run it through on my table saw, and I'm going to make a separate video about that. It might even be up by the time that you're watching this, so make sure you check the course or the YouTube channel for that, and I'll show you the technique that I use for both scarfing gunnels and scarfing stringers, although it's not something I do very often because it's kind of a pain. So, very last thing I want to say is that if you're taking my online kayak building course, you can send me a text at any time about anything to do with your build. So if while you're picking out your boards here, you're not sure if a board is good enough, just take a picture of the wood and send it to me, and I'll take a look at it and tell you if it's good or if it's not, and that applies to anything during your kayak building process. So that is our video here for selecting wood for skin-on frame kayaks. Good luck building your boat.